Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of July, 2024 year. A lot of events have happened today, so let's get started, and we will start with you from the Poltava region. And the VIX of the Russian Federation, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, published another footage of strikes in this area. In these frames, we can observe with you the oil storage or storage of fuel and lubricants, and during the reconnaissance activities. The quantity was determined at the exact time, the exact location, and as a result of the impact. This warehouse of fuel and lubricants was destroyed. Ukrainians suffered quite significant damage as a result of this event, this strike. I remind you that a few days ago, or rather the last few days, we have been receiving quite a large number of geolocations of personnel from the Poltava region. From the area of Mirgorod, Poltava. There are at least 2 military airfields here. Just 2 days ago, footage of strikes on Ukrainian airfields with a large number of Su-27 was published. Up to 7 pieces were destroyed according to the report of the Ministry of Defense. If there were exactly 5 destroyed, 2 were hit, or rather damaged. In the area of Kryvyi Rog, just yesterday, we received footage of strikes on the Kryvyi Rog airfield, as a result of which several MiG-29 were destroyed, and also the Mi-8 helicopter was destroyed in the area of Poltava. In other words, the Russian Federation is working very closely. And we see with you the complete absence or opposition from the Ukrainian air defense. What have we been waiting for? We are moving to the line of contact, and we will start with you from the South Donetsk direction. Since no serious news has been received in the Zaporozhye or Kherson over the past day. Well, with the exception of in Odessa, just before the video was taken, shots of strikes on some warehouses were published, possibly on production facilities that were used in the forest for the production of BEX, for the assembly of drones. But these warehouses, as you can see, were destroyed. It's interesting, yes, it's worth paying attention to, let's say. The construction of defensive lines along the Black Sea coast in the Odessa region, and according to the author of this video, these lines of defense are planned to be used as some kind of protection against a possible landing in this direction. Well, let's move on. We will return to the South Donetsk direction, and we will start with you from the settlement of Prechistovka. As you can see, over the past day, at least 4 geolocations have been published from this direction, which once again confirms that at the moment Prechistovka is the place of the highest concentration of strikes by Russian troops. Strikes are inflicted by MERS, strikes are inflicted by aviation. Strikes are inflicted in general by everything that can only be carried, including endless drones flying. And I repeat that, again, according to the high concentration of strikes, it can be concluded that the re-clearing is a priority goal for Russian units, for the Russian military command, and it is quite likely. Based on all these geolocations, it can be concluded that in the near future the Russian side will begin to probe the defense, already trying to push the defense to earth. That is, there will be attempts to storm from several directions. Then we are moving with you to the area of Konstantinovka, Novomikhailovka. Opposition battles are being fought here, or rather, to be more precise, the Ukrainian side is experiencing big problems with artillery. And there is some kind of artillery starvation, shell starvation, but from the Russian side, there are no problems, any obstacles there. Therefore, most of the work is carried out by heavy artillery from the Russian side on positions inside the settlement of Konstantinovka. And here on these frames, we can observe how a Russian drone flies over the village itself, trying to identify certain positions. Advanced strongholds, which are immediately struck by the flamethrower system of the sun. In other words, all these shots confirm that fighting may resume in the near future. And perhaps the Russian side will again try to storm the settlement from the southeast, in order to gain a foothold on Mira Street and Sevchenko Street. Then we are moving with you to the West Avdiivka direction along Maximilievka, Georgievka, Konstantinovka Sirius. Krasnogorsk received no serious news. But regarding the West Avdiivka direction, there are a lot of geolocations and a lot of adjustments along the front line today. We will start with geolocations. Everything is basically quite simple here. The armed forces of Ukraine continue to gradually try to evacuate equipment, weapons, soldiers, equipment from this small artillery pocket. All of this is under the close control of a unit of the Russian army, and we regularly receive from here more and more fresh footage of another strike by another insignificant Western equipment. Such a story is happening here. As for the territory from the north of Novoseliovka first to the settlement of Vozdvizenka there are a lot of interesting geolocations, a lot of interesting adjustments. According to pro-Ukrainian cartographers, during the fighting, the Russian army managed to significantly expand the control zone. In the area of the settlements of Voskhod, Sokol, and Yevgenyevka, the settlement of Voskhod itself finally came under the control of Russian units. This is according to Ukrainian sources. At the moment, neither the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation nor sources on the ground confirm this information. More precisely, it simply bypasses it, since in the absence of any data. And as for the settlement on Vozdvizenka, in this direction, in the area of Novoalexandrovka, the armed forces of the Russian Federation launched several attacks in the direction of the locality of Lozovskaya, and, apparently, during the fighting, it was also possible to significantly expand the control zone. As you can see, we have painted a significant territory southwest of Novoalexandrovka. And we have footage confirming exactly the offensive attempts. To be more precise, the footage was published by the Ukrainian side, on which we can observe a certain amount of destroyed Russian equipment, a certain amount of abandoned equipment. Due to the fact that the troops landed from the security target, the forest fields are occupied, the equipment is abandoned, yes. Until better times, let's say. Well, of course, all equipment is immediately destroyed by Ukrainian drones, but in general, if we summarize, and in general, if we discuss this video, then the most advanced, the most extreme position of Russian units was deployed precisely at the intersection of two forest belts. That is, as close as possible to the locality of Lizaska. According to the data, the distance to this highway is already less than 1.5 kilometers. As we see with you, Russian units are trying to wedge themselves into the defense between Vozdvizenka and Progress, and thereby try to disrupt logistics between the two units. Since from the very Lizaska, in fact, fire control over Timofeevka is established, and, in fact, the supply shoulder to Vozdvizenka increases. In general, to transfer a unit from one part to another, you will have to make a very large shoulder through almost Pokrovsky, almost Mirgrad. In other words, such an interesting story is developing in this direction. Then we are moving with you to Toretsky, to New York. Here, as you can see, we have a large number of geolocations, some contradictory, controversial, but it's worth discussing each one. And we will start with you from Novgorod, New York, Yuryevka, and according to some pro-Russian sources, in general. We started writing about this yesterday, and according to exactly the information that was published in the open access by the armed forces of the Russian Federation, and continued to develop success further. From Yuryevka to the north, the direction is already in the central part of Novgorod, and during the fighting, it was possible to establish control over Petrovsky Mountain. That is, as I understand it, Petrovskaya Gora is a separate quarter of Novgorodsky. Here is a small industrial zone, a block of high-rise buildings. And this territory may have already partially come under the control of Russian units. We see with you that every day, in fact every day, the Russian army is advancing an additional kilometer 2 or 3. In general, it seems that the APU has no divisions at all. The only thing that stops the Russian part is perhaps a minefield, traps, perhaps some other such and such trifles. But definitely not units of the Ukrainian army. If the information about the advance of the Russian units is confirmed, then, in fact, with such an advance, with such an attack, the Russian side will be able to essentially cut off the supply route going from Novgorodsky to Sukhoi Balka. In other words, let's put it on the map for understanding. According to the latest news, this highway is either under fire control or has already been cut. And if we talk about the Novgorod Turkish agglomeration itself, then there are not so many supply routes that the APU can use to support, let's say, a more or less stable defense. And one of the most important routes has already been essentially cut. There are several more roads from the north, but to solve this problem, Russian units are trying to move along the railway. From the settlement of Friendship Delivka Dalin Alexander Shultina, and in case of successful progress, Toretsky, New York may be surrounded. As for Pivnichny Toretsk itself, here as we see, there is a large number of geolocations, and yesterday, if you remember, We discussed with you that Ukrainian sources published footage of strikes on this citadel, on this part of the city with high-rise buildings. However, today, Russian sources, let's say, have published their refutation, assuring that the footage was mistakenly published by Ukrainians and on the footage that is at the 20th second. Let's look at them again. Here comes the 19th 20th second. Here are the strikes on the citadel in Pivnichny. These shots were taken by the Ukrainian side and published mistakenly. The footage showed an artillery strike from the Russian side on Ukrainian positions. But despite this, most of the cartographers have updated their cuttings. They're painting over additional territories under the color of the control of Russian units. Separately, the cartographers assured that the Russian units went straight into this part and well, based on these frames, but as we see, a refutation was published later. And some neutral cartographers claim that they managed to enter the citadel from the south, in fact along the Street of Youth, and take control of the first high-rise building. The same information is essentially confirmed by the pro-Ukrainian cartographers Deep State. At the moment, we are not in a hurry to update the maps yet, we are waiting for some geolocations, more or less sane evidence. But in general, all the same, the disputed territory is plotted on the map, which, according to individual cartographers, is already under the full control of Russian units. As for the geolocation of the video, today shots of artillery training and, in fact, strikes on the edge of the forest were published, precisely between private buildings and Russian positions. Perhaps in these frames we see artillery training before the actions that subsequently led to such a significant advance in the area of this citadel. In any case, it can be summed up that the fighting continues, Russian units are storming, and it is also worth noting that there is practically no resistance, or resistance is extremely insignificant. Perhaps there are problems with reserves, with resources, and as of the 4th of July, the FU has not managed to stabilize the situation in this sector of the front. If we compare the end of New York with Volchansk, then by this day the situation in Volchansk more or less began to stabilize. Here we still see that the situation is extremely far from any stabilization. Also, in the area of the north of Donetsk, the Donbass Channel, pro-Ukrainian cartographers also note additional progress. More precisely, the APU apparently retreats, and empty support posts, trenches gradually come under the control of Russian units. As for Yar's Watch, there are no changes here. A small operational pause. Let me remind you that the other day both the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian Military Command confirmed the complete fall of the eastern clock of the Yar. All Ukrainian units were withdrawn to the central and western parts, and the Russian units are not yet seeking and are not in a hurry to cross the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, as regrouping is most likely leading. For a very long time, there were battles for the eastern part. For a very long time, in fact, the Russian units climbed the mountain. And when they were already at the heights of the Yarsky clock, now there is already time to rest, plan, bring fresh forces, and resume the offensive with renewed vigor. In any case, the offensive will be resumed since there is a serious and very significant advance both in Novgorod and in Toretsk. And in general, the Yar clock is, as it were, common, let's say, with a detail of the general puzzle. The general picture is in the Konstantinovsky direction. As for Seversk, there has been no serious significant news over the past day. The situation is similar with the South Kapinsky direction. The only interesting, let's say, information slipped through the network that Russian units entered Makiivka. According to the information, you visited Makiivka yesterday, but for some reason, it was decided not to consolidate. In fact, we walked along the first advanced south, let's say, eastern buildings, and rolled back to the area of forest belts into the fields. And today they have already come again, and today they are trying to finally gain a foothold and finally, let's say, establish a stable springboard for further cleansing and the final capture of the village itself. Regarding the Severopinski direction, we have no changes. A large number of shots of artillery strikes have been published, but without active phases of the offensive on the ground, without active episodes of combat operations on the ground. And the Kharkiv direction has come to life again. Fighting is underway again, artillery strikes are being carried out. The FABs are flying again. Approximately on these frames, we can observe with you the arrival of several FABs, 1,500, possibly 3,000. In the locality of Lipetsk, exactly in that part of the locality, and where the APU is trying to concentrate the unit, before the possible further offensive on both Lukyansk and Gluboko. And in general, all these strikes, of course, daily disrupt any attempts to counterattack the enemy, which leads primarily to losses, to confusion, and to another, let's say, day that ended in favor of the Russian units. The blow is also applied in the area of the settlement green is not boring. Also, the AFU strongholds are being worked out, strikes are being carried out, and perhaps some kind of preparation is being conducted before a possible further offensive. Pay attention to how accurately the blows are struck. The forest belt is actually not so wide, but two FABs, 22500, most likely lay down tightly, and exactly on target. Not a gram in the fields, everything is clear on the strong points. And as for Volchansk, here as you can see, a large number of frames were also published. In Voronezh, the settlement of Tikhaya in the Isu still managed to concentrate some small forces, and perhaps an offensive attempt is expected in the near future. Therefore, the Russian side is very dense, qualitatively and accurately fulfills this village, not allowing it to cross this last frontier, before it will be possible to move to the quarry area between East Volchansk and the village of Tikhaya itself, and therefore, everything is still on pause here again. Blows are inflicted on both the southern and northern Lupus. The blow is dealt by the Grad sidefire system. Well, the gunners are working, as you can see today from this point of view from the front, without active changes on the ground. Mostly artillery work. Heavy with heavy artillery. Of interest, again, it is worth paying attention to the report of the North Group of troops. Once again, Russian sources report further progress, further expansion of the bridgehead of the eastern village of Bugovatka. However, to this day we have not received any geolocation or frames, but only posts in Telegram channels. But in any case, most likely such an event is happening somewhere. We are waiting. The first shots will most likely be published in the near future. And today, of course, everyone on the internet is discussing the correction on the map, which was made by the Ukrainian pro-Ukrainian cartographer Deep State. Today, they finally painted the Sotnitsky Cossack in red, which confirms full control over the terrain. After their adjustment, all the other cartographers began to adjust their maps one by one. We, in turn, are not in a hurry to do this yet, as we are waiting for geolocations. And also about the fact that the Centenary Cossack came under the control of Russian units, or in the gray zone. The information was received, in my opinion, a week ago, or something like that. And even then, pro-Ukrainian cartographers painted the map of the village in gray, in the disputed zone. But today they have finally repainted it in red. We are waiting, but in any case, judging by the number of intensity of artillery strikes in the Zolokhiv direction over the past day, we can really conclude that most likely the Sotnik Cossack has come under control. And the thing is that the unit is pulling closer and closer to the line of contact, and perhaps in the near future. Perhaps on the eve of the NATO summit in Washington, the Russian side will launch an offensive on the settlements of Uda, Cossack Lopan, and the settlement of Zolochev. And so that it is during this NATO summit that new flags of the Russian Federation are raised daily over the next points. Settlements of Ukraine as a whole, so that it is during this summit that they once again show some kind of complete impotence in Ukraine to resist Russian offensive operations. Right now, it is the accumulation of forces, the accumulation of funds, so that it is on these days. But to show the greatest activity, the greatest intensity, and, in general, to crumple the picture. Regardless of what promises, what issues will be discussed during this summit, and what will be promised to Ukraine. Regardless of what will be promised Ukraine and so on. If we talk about political news, then it is worth paying attention to the fact that the United States of America has promised to provide another assistance in the amount of as many as $0.2 billion. Basically, this assistance will contain air defense missiles. This is generally understandable because we are with you. Once again, it is worth paying attention, remembering all these strikes in central Ukraine, where, in fact, Ukraine is completely helpless. Then, without air defense missiles, such strikes will only continue, their intensity will only increase. There is also information that this month in July, Ukraine will be handed over the 1st to the 16th. And perhaps by the end of this month, we will see the first fighting, perhaps the first shots of objective control. As another one or another F-16 falls as a result of a Russian missile strike or an air defense system.